So, despair, which Kierkegaard seems to throw into the mix kind of arbitrarily, that is, what does despair have to do with anything? That's the kind of question, I think, that can only be answered by reading further in the book. Why is despair at the heart of what he's talking about? Well, eventually, hopefully, it will become clear. If we look at the bottom of page 43, Kierkegaard makes a claim about despair, that there's two forms of it. There's the despair of not wanting to be yourself, and then there's despair of wanting to be yourself. And that if it weren't for the existence of God, it would only be the former, the despair of not wanting to be yourself. It couldn't be a despair of wanting to be yourself. I hope that eventually it becomes clear why he thinks that. That is, that if it weren't for God, there would be no such thing as wanting in despair to be oneself. That would only make sense if God exists, and I think eventually we'll see why. But about that latter form of despair, the despair of wanting to be yourself, or in despair wanting to be yourself, look at the top of page 44. He says of this latter formula, the despair of wanting to be yourself, is the expression of the relations, the self's total dependence, the expression of the fact that the self cannot by itself arrive at or remain in equilibrium and rest, but only in relating to itself by relating to that which has established the whole relation. And if you go down a little farther to the end of that section, towards the bottom of page 44, he says something similar. He says, this then is the formula which describes the state of the self when despair is completely eradicated. That is, when the self has achieved a state of non-despairing. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. So there's a wanting to be oneself which is not despairing. And that is wanting to be yourself when the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. Looking ahead, that transparently is important. That is, a lot of this book, no doubt, is about relating to God. And not only relating to God, but knowing that you're relating to God. And that's what that transparently thing means, I think, in that sense. Because I think Kierkegaard's view of what it means to be a person, a self, is that we are always in the presence of God. As we find out as this thing unfolds, that is our situation. We are not always aware of being in the presence of God. That is, it's not always transparent, clear to us that we are in the presence of God. But becoming aware of being in the presence of God and wanting to be the self that you are in the presence of God is exactly what it means not to be in despair. And maybe we can relate back that to what he says in the preface on page 35, that Christian heroism is to risk unreservedly being oneself, being one's true self. So this notion of despair is actually quite important. So I just want to say a few things about the pages that follow, really up through page 51. And I know that you can't have a million videos here. I'm trying to keep it down to about 45 minutes a week. We are the kind of creatures that despair. It hasn't been explained what despair is yet, but that's the kind of creatures we are. And what does that mean? Well, maybe we can ask why. Not why do we despair, but how can we despair? He says at the bottom of page 44, under the section B, the possibility and actuality of despair, he asks the question whether despair is a merit or a defect. That is despair something we should be proud of? Is it a merit? Or is it something we should be ashamed of, a defect? And he makes an important distinction. The capacity for despair, that is, that we can despair, that we have the capability of despair, is a merit. He says it is the possibility of this sickness, he says in the top of page 45, is man's advantage over the beast. So the fact that we can despair, that we're able to despair, is a merit. But to actually be in despair, to actualize that capacity, is the defect. He goes on page 45 to say, consequently, it is an infinite merit to be able to despair. And yet, not only is it the greatest misfortune and misery actually to be in despair, no, it is ruin. So he points out that's rather odd, to be proud of the capacity to despair, but to be ashamed and to be ruined by actually being in despair is a rather odd thing. What is it that allows us to be in despair? I think if we go back to the beginning of this section and what he says about being a self, and the essential part of being a self is being able to relate to yourself. That is, to be self-aware, self-conscious, is exactly the needed prerequisite for despair. That is, if we were not able to be self-conscious, we would not be able to despair. And he puts this in interesting language on page 46 in the beginning of the second paragraph. He asks the question, where then does despair come from? That is, why do we despair? Continues, from the relation in which the synthesis relates to itself. From the relation in which the synthesis, which is our humanity, relates to itself. That is, from self-consciousness. From the fact that God, who made man this relation, then, as it were, lets go of it. That is, from the relations relating to itself. Very interesting language. We assume here that we are created by God, as the rest of the universe was created by God. But God created everything else, the animals, the trees, the planets, sky, everything. He created it and apparently held on to it. He created one thing, the self, or the person capable of being a self, created that thing and let go of it. And it's that letting go, that notion that God let us go, that God released us, which is this the Kierkegaard is very ambivalent about that being let go by God, and I think he's saying that every human being is ambivalent about that being let go by God, because that enables us to be in despair, and another thing it enables us to do is to be self-conscious. So it's our self-consciousness that makes us the beings capable of despair. But what actually puts us in despair? What Kierkegaard is very clear about in this section, I think, is that if one is ever in despair, it is because one chose to be in despair. It says at the top of page 47, every actual moment of despair is to be referred back to its possibility. Every moment he despairs, he brings it on himself. Now that's odd, it's an odd thing to say, and it's very important thing to say, as we'll see, because it has to do with our freedom. Self-consciousness, self-awareness makes possible our selfhood. That is, we could not be selves unless we were aware of ourselves. But what does it mean to be a self more generally? It means to be a unique person, to be an irreplaceable, unique person, to be a self. And it also means to be a self, like being a person, it means being capable of taking responsibility for one's actions. And to be capable of taking that sort of responsibility entails that one is capable of making free choices so that you can take responsibility for what you do. So what goes along with being self-conscious, with being a self, is being free.